All right. Well, it looks like we're right about on start time here. Would you like to give a little introduction, what we're going to be doing, or would you like me to just start off with the video?
Um, yeah, I'll give a quick introduction. My name is Nick. There's also an introduction in the video, but I'll quickly it's a crash course. It kind of walks through some gotchas inside of Swift development. There's a um, GitHub page that really you could potentially pull that down, launch it in Xcode. Everything should work fine, and it'll make a web service call. Some of those things are the common pitfalls that I've seen over the years in hackathons where devs will unfortunately spend hours or quite a bit of like hack time just to kind of get up and going. So this is kind of like that primer to kind of here's a sample base application. Um, it's not a pretty application, but it shows you some of the mechanics of some of the pitfalls that you see in Xcode or iOS development, like Cocoapods and stuff. So been doing development for about 20 years. So I think that's about it. If you want to go ahead and play it, that's fine. Also, like if you guys have any questions throughout the entire session, just go ahead and put them in the chat while you think about them or write them down. I want this to be more of an open session, so I think that's about it.
All right, let's get to it then.
Okay, all right, thanks. Developer at Panera. Hey there, this is Nick Neuberger, Senior iOS Developer at Panera. Here to talk to you about the iOS Tech Talk crash course in iOS development. Who wants to learn iOS development and have a crash course? Let's do this. You guys ready for this? Ready to have fun? After my info-packed Tech Talk, you'll be a mobile iOS developer before you know it. Little bit about me. I've been a senior iOS developer at Panera for about 5 years now. I've been programming 25 years. Done a whole gamut of different things. AWS IoT Core, I do some of that stuff on the side. Built 8 mobile applications, some in the restaurant and boating industries. Prior to that, 10 years ago, I was doing Java Stack stuff. And even prior to that, doing some Visual Basic stuff. If you guys want to connect on LinkedIn, go ahead and do that. There's my LinkedIn profile. These are the 2 main applications that I've pretty much been focused on at Panera. We have the kiosk application and the mobile application. Both of those applications are somewhat shared to a certain extent. So, I'm married, I got 4 kids, 2 grandkids, got a YouTube channel called Midwest Flying, a whopping 15 subs. Got a ham radio license, trying to learn Spanish. Do a whole host of iOS projects on the side as well. So I keep very busy. Here's 2 additional things. Always keep on learning, be passionate. Some of those are the biggest kind of mantras, if you will, that I kind of look for. I'm an older guy. Sometimes I feel like a dinosaur in the IT world, but I have to keep my skills up all the time. So you guys should do that as well. Here's the fun stuff that I enjoy. I do flying. That's an iPad. Some other things. It kind of gave me the inspiration for the demo that's on GitHub. So I'll show you guys that in a minute. So the important thing is do what you're passionate about. And you'll never feel like you're working again. So it's one good thing about programming that I always enjoy is learning. And here's a Raspberry Pi that's built on Raspberry Pi. I've got that loaded, so I do navigation. Kind of cool stuff. So here's what you're going to actually learn in 60 minutes. Learn about me, of course. Kind of already did that. Tricks of the trade, what you'll need to learn, the tools, some stats on iOS, Swift in the market, goods and bads of iOS. There's a whole host of different things there. Force unwraps, optionals, guards. So if you've never had that experience with Swift, this will kind of prime you and kind of get you ready. How to make web service calls. That's pretty much standard nowadays. Within this sample application, I've made some web service calls. I'm actually using a pod or an external library called Alamo Fire, and that is using like JSON and using codable implementations. That's kind of almost a critical thing that you have to know nowadays for Swift. One of the other cool thing about codable on the bottom there is like it's great for storing for reuse. So say for example, if you have a hack that you want to store data and the internet's down, but you've already made that web service call, you can actually use codable and user defaults to actually store that locally. It's a simple way of doing it as opposed to using something like core data. Here's some additional things: how to build a list and detail page linked to the web service data. There's also some segs in the project. I'll try and show you that in a little bit. Storing data locally using user defaults. I kind of mentioned that just a second ago. Pulling in a new Cocopod. This is the biggest thing that you might end up running into. Some previous hacks that I've actually been with, you know, you may spend 20 or 30 minutes trying to pull in a new Cocopod. I'm going to digress here a little bit. Cocoapods is kind of an older technology, but Swift and Xcode and Apple, they're really trying to push more on Swift Package Manager. This presentation isn't really about Swift Package Manager, but you can actually run both at the same time. Cocoapods seems a little bit more prevalent. Swift Package Manager is definitely getting to that point. I use Swift Package Manager pretty much on all my side projects. But at Panera, we actually use Cocoapods. So we may touch a little bit about Git Flow, just some screenshots. It's really advanced release management to maintain Git branches. Super awesome feature. I use it on side projects. Fastlane, same thing. You probably won't use Git Flow or even Fastlane for your hacks, but it's really cool technology. Fastlane's pretty impressive. Well, here's what you'll pretty much need. You'll need Xcode, macOS Catalina, and potentially even you could use Big Sur as well. Homebrew, probably end up having to install that. Cocoapods, definitely you'll end up using Discord. Postman, I'll try and show you guys a quick demo of Postman where you can actually make a web service call, get the JSON data back. There's another cool application, I think it's called Type.io. I'll try and show you that, where you can actually generate Swift stubs super fast. Source tree, Swift or Swift, that's probably one of the best Cocoapods or Swift package. There's hundreds. I think there's 500 extensions that you can use for Swift. I use it for everything, just about. Fastlane and Charles. Charles is actually pretty good for debugging JSON calls. You can quickly see the request and response cycles. It's free to download. There's an expiration. I think it shuts down after 2 hours, but we use it all the time at Panera. Okay, so go to my GitHub page really quick, and here's the link, tinyurl.com/pickhacks-iOS. You could probably even search for Neuberger1 on GitHub. So that's where all the source code is for this project. And let's do this. And if you haven't started downloading Xcode, do it now. It's huge. So, and fork the code if needed. Potentially you could use this sample application to quickly do a web service call. You can basically download this app and run it through Xcode and slightly tweak the web service calls, and you're kind of pretty much up and going. You could pretty much copy the project to a certain extent. This is more about where you're at in this journey. Are you completely new to Xcode or iOS? 1 year development, 3 years, or 5? What about Objective-C or even Swift? I would definitely focus on Swift for a hack. Objective-C is pretty much rolling out. It's on live support to a certain extent. Why iOS development? 2.2 million apps on the App Store, It's easier now with Swift. Objective-C, boo. I've been using Objective-C for years, so but I love Swift. Fifth major version of Swift. Dependency managers, 67,000 libraries. Build tools like I explained, sort of Fastlane, CI/CD. We're actually setting up some CI/CD pipelines at Panera right now. And we go back there, Swift UI. This presentation isn't necessarily about Swift UI, but it's Swift UI is pretty advanced. I use it on one of my projects on the side. It's pretty amazing. We use it a little bit at Panera. That's pretty much the kind of the go-to standard, but I would caution it seems to slow you down. There's not a huge amount of available samples out there on the net. Sometimes you struggle to actually get things going. So maybe for the hack, I would probably strongly suggest using Storyboards as a quick prototype module, unless you're really familiar with Swift UI. Why iOS development? Just real quickly there, down at the bottom, Swift UI, Objective-C. It's still pretty much about the same. There's still huge project support for JavaScript or even Java, but like I mentioned, there's huge app support out on the App Store for Swift. I'm really surprised I didn't see Flutter or Dart on this yet, but I do think those are up and coming as well. That's the YouTube video that explains it. It's kind of cool. You can see the trends going up and down. And why iOS development? Jobs. In some cases, Panera is always hiring for internships and full-time mobile positions. If you're interested, you can potentially send me your LinkedIn or a resume. I can keep it on file, or I can send it to some of my directors, and maybe in the future we could pull you guys in. Quickly about Panera IT. We do yearly hackathons. Love doing the hackathons. You'll probably see a video on the initial launch of PickHacks. We do pumpkin carving, segways. We've got segways. Well, with COVID, we're still a little remote, but we do demo balls and fun stuff like that. Total lines of code. I just wanted to share this. I mean, we have a huge code base just for the mobile app itself, 126,000 lines of code. It's almost migrated completely to Swift. I love it. It's slowly trending down. We're constantly refactoring. So it's a code base that's been there for a while. So we've predominantly been the leaders in the restaurant industry. So we've been out there for years. All right, quick pointers for iOS development. So force unwraps and why it's bad. If you're not familiar with force unwraps, you see that exclamation point right there? So the URL class and the URL request class, there's an optional there. So why is that bad? It will basically crash your application. You might be able to use that for a hackathon, but we definitely steer away for that at Panera. Don't use them, almost never. Almost never. Rare cases do we ever even use the force unwrap option. They will lead to crashes, and you'll be searching around in Crashlytics or something like that. So, or Fabric. Optionals in Swift. If you're not familiar with optionals, see where it says geoname.text edition ? Geoname. That's an optional. So we've got a var edition class that's optional. That is kind of an optional chaining there. It's okay. In some cases, there's better options to do guardlets. So that's one of the differences in some cases about Swift. Allows annullable for a variable. All callers must be checked for it before accessing the variable. So using an if-let. So in many cases, you want to use some kind of if-let, and all these examples that I'm showing you is actually in the code base. These are directly from the code base that's on my GitHub page. So the if-let error, you're basically forcing that object to be there, so you don't have to worry about nil objects or anything. So in Swift, that's a pretty common practice. Options in Swift and why it's a pain. So it seems like it's always doing a guard let, or if it's a let, sometimes try to minimize those optionals. In some cases, it's always easier to always have that variable, but it's always one of those things that new developers get into that, at least for Swift, they kind of get confused on optional chaining versus optional versus non-optional. So basically that if let guarantees that object's there. Guard lets. Here's some awesome things for you. If you're not familiar with guard lets, it basically allows you to check for an optional and check on an optional and return that object. If it's not there, it calls the else statement. So it's a pretty good pattern, design pattern that I guess Swift provides, that it guarantees that object called addition right there is going to be there for the following function lines in that function. So you don't necessarily have to worry about optionals through your code. It's a very good common practice. We use it all the time for guard lets in all of our code. One thing to add there, you see the note Swift or Swift function. These two functions are actually functions that are coming from Swift or Swift. That's an actual pod that's in the code base. So ultimately, there's so many functions in Swift or Swift, it's just easier in some cases to just use those. Without that, potentially you get crashes getting items out of indexes or out of an array that could cause crashes. So definitely some nice features with Swift or Swift. Okay, let's talk about the sample application. Since I'm a pilot, love flying. This is one of the chart supplement books that I'm actually pulling this data from the mobile app and getting this and showing it on the screen. So we'll kind of run through this a little bit. Within that chart supplement, we're going to show and pop up this PDF file or a page in the PDF file. Here's some of the screens you'll see in a second, and I'll try and walk through Charles or even proxy. Actually, I don't have Charles proxy running right now, so I'll end up having to just show Postman. So let's go ahead and do a demo. So I have the application here already pre-installed. So let's kind of walk through some of this code before I actually launch the application. Actually, let's just launch the application and then we'll kind of walk back through it. You'll see that there. So the application launches, and so right there, it actually made a web service call and pulled that data back. So you can actually make a call, and this is actually showing this specific page of that file. So it's kind of cryptic the way this is, but I did it kind of on purpose to kind of show just quick navigational usage within the application. So it's launching specific PDFs, and it's ultimately coming from a JSON endpoint. You can kind of scroll through it. It's not much in the application, but it's a functional component that you may end up having to walk through for your hack. So it's a quick link, and then there's a seg. Let me go and explain a little bit more of this to you. So this isn't necessarily using MVC architecture. Well, I guess to a certain extent, it's using a base form of MVC architecture. But the important thing is that it's using storyboards. So I've got a storyboard here, a main root view controller with a table view controller. You may end up having something like that in your hack that has a root view controller and you're navigating back and forth and certain things like that. That's actually a seg, and this is the additional page that has that data on it. So quite commonly, here's the table view controller that actually pulls this data. Let's navigate to here. It's using a chart service. So there's some form of object-oriented here in this class or in this project. And here's where I'm actually using Alamo Fire to actually get this data. I'll explain some of this more in a minute. Here's the chart service. This is something that you may end up having to do is fetch data from the internet. So right here, I've just got a simple web service call. We're making a call to the FAA.gov and pulling back data. One of the main reasons why I use Alamo Fire in this case is because it's very declarative. It's real easy to read. There's some more simple APIs based on Swift, but they're a little bit harder to integrate, I think, in my opinion. Basically, you just pass in headers. You can do a get, put, post, certain things like that, and you're passing in parameters. So let me jump over to Postman. So this is Postman. It's a quite common tool that developers used. So I've got this endpoint here actually in Postman. So I'm going to show you some of the JSON data. So if we make this request again, quite commonly you're probably going to have to pull in data from the internet, and it'll probably look something like this. At least I'd hope it looks like JSON and not XML. But in this case, it's pulling back tons of data from this endpoint. You can see geo name for Iowa. There's Missouri in here. I'm going to show you a cool feature here. I'm going to jump back here and I'm going to show you this chart supplement domain model. So the cool thing about Alamo Fire is that there's generated stubs. I use a project called QuickType. You want to learn this really quick. Love this thing. I use it quite often. This is it's a website out there. You can actually generate stubs for just about any language. What I'm going to do is, whoops, that's not what I want to do. Copy this whole data structure and paste it in here. Meant, if I can spell. Is that right? Oh, well, anyway. So I've got this generated struct that I basically got from this QuickType website. So what I do here is I already copied it, pasted it in here. I select Swift, I select struct. Usually I always use structs for data that doesn't change and that's coming from the web service. There's another option, Alamo Fire extension. So it literally will generate you stubs for Alamo Fire specifically. So the only difference really is these encoders and decoders and the data request serialization classes. So I've already got that. The cool thing about it, it just basically generates that for you. And you create a new class and you're just about up and going. For this example, I actually used some of this work for Mizzou Hacks last year. the data's changed a little bit, so I ended up having to swap this out from a edition date. Originally it was a class, but there's no need for this class even, so I ended up switching it to a string. Works fine. So that's a model object. Here's some of the defaults. Oh, yeah, this is some of the additional features that I actually built into this application. So I'm actually storing it to user defaults and loading it on the fly as needed. So it's one nice thing that I mentioned in the presentation about the Codable implementation. So you can basically get data. You can get data from the internet, implement this Codable, and store it to disk. Super easy. It's the easiest way of actually storing data. Core data is a little bit more complicated, to say the least, to actually do that. All right, so this is the model object, and that pretty much kind of showed you the Postman call, showed you the mobile application, and showed you Postman. There might be a few more things here that I could probably explain. Yeah, so if you do some kind of hack, you may end up having to show table data. If you guys have questions, go ahead and post those in Slack. I'm sorry, not Slack, Discord. I'll try and help you guys out to a certain extent, and I'll try and be online. So my focus is mostly iOS development. I do know some Node.js and web services and AWS stuff. So yeah, this shows you a detailed view controller showing that data, and that's basically what pops up right here. That's the list. This is the detailed data. So there's some limited functionality there. The most important one that may slow you down is the web service calls, I think. I think that's it on the demo application. That's a stub that you won't care about. And just some simple extensions for equatability and stuff like that. So let's go back to the presentation. If I can find it. Swift or Swift, I've kind of already mentioned that a little bit. It's got a collection of 500 native Swift extensions. I would highly recommend you adding that to your project. There's so many reasons that I use it over and over. Making web service calls, I've kind of explained that in some of the demo. I'll kind of go into a little bit more detail. So yeah, Alamo Fire, that's one way of actually making a web service call that returns JSON. And I use the QuickType website for quickly generating stubs for the model objects that come back. And then usually they always implement Codable. You can store it to disk using user defaults. There's an example in the project for that. And Postman. So I kind of already showed you Postman. This is like a daily commodity for developers quite often. Okay, we'll go to the next one. Here's one of those common things that early devs kind of get slowed down is Cocoapods. They're still very prevalent. Why use Cocoapods? There's just tons of open source libraries. You can go to the Cocoapods main website and you can search for something. It usually keeps everything indexed. I like the fact that Cocoapods does that. I don't think Swift Package Manager really has this single site that you can go to and search for packages. Yeah, so some of the good things, faster to market, pulling in a Facebook library or a Snapchat library, and then you usually go to their website and do the integration. Usually they'll have a Cocoapods example, and now the Swift Package Manager examples as well. So one thing, let me show you how I can include this new Cocopod. I modified this project a little bit to not have one of the pods. So I'm going to go ahead and show you this demo real quick. So I'm going to include an alert library. So here's the pod file. Here's where these common pods actually go, and SC alert view. I'm going to include that into the project. So I'll go to the command line. So I got a whole bunch of changes. Let's ignore that one other than the pod lock file. So we'll do a pod install. We're going to include this new library. See how it says installing SC alert view? It's doing its thing. Swift Package Manager is, to a certain extent, a little bit easier. Cocopod files are generated. In some cases, it's a pain. Okay, pod installation complete. Look at that. Nice, it didn't fail on my demo. And let's go back to Xcode. And now we should be able to go back here and include this. And I just had a simple one-line command. So if you need some kind of alert window, this one's kind of nice. It's open source as well. Basically on launch, it's going to show this alert view now. So I literally pulled in a new pod and added it to the project. Let's go ahead and run it. And once I click this, it'll pop up. See, welcome to PickHacks. Yay, it actually worked. Didn't fail. So that's kind of a Cocopod change. So in some cases, that really trips people up using Cocoapods. All right. That's example pod file. It's more of an extended pod file. So kind of already did that. I'm a little ahead of myself, actually. Use Git Flow. Git Flow, I explained that a little bit further down the road. I actually ran that, did the pod install, and integrated the code and ran it already. So how to build a list and detail page in Storyboard. I'll kind of explain some of these things. I'll show you the Storyboard. There's some auto layout. Let's fix some layout issues. Loading data onto the list. I kind of explained some of that already. I'm way ahead of myself. So I'll quickly go through this. We're already at 30 minutes. I may cut this a little shorter just for Q&A. All right, so yeah, so here's the main view controller, table view controller that actually loads that data. Let's go a little bit closer. So yeah, you'll end up adding specific UI labels to each one of these screens, and then in some cases doing these segs. You don't have to use segs. I just showed this from a clarity perspective, and how it drills to this detail page visually. So there's these fields that are in the table view controller. Here's the table view controller. And you can do, in some cases, you can do like a side-by-side. Like that. Okay. And there's also the detail page. Kind of show you some of that as well. So on the detail page, you've got a UI label, you've got another one, and a web view container. So ultimately, I'm kind of loading that data on the fly through a web view container. So I'm getting ultimately that URL that's on that product. I'll kind of show you that a little bit. So these, I think each one of these, yeah. So the sub object is a product which has the URL. So ultimately I'm I'm feeding that this URL PDF link to this function, and it basically loads that into the web view container. It's kind of a common practice to use web views in some cases. This was like a quick and dirty solution. And so yeah, there's one thing. Let me back this up a little bit. See if I can find the seg as well. Sometimes that might trip people up. Yeah. So in some cases you've got segs and there's like a prepare for function. You'll see these override navigations and segs. So you don't necessarily have to do any of that stuff with Swift UI. But yeah, it's kind of a common practice to transition storyboard to storyboard. Panera, we don't necessarily use segs. We use other programmatic means, and we use a subset of Viper architecture. I think that is it on that. There we go. Got to find the presentation back. Sorry. Storing local data. Advantages of storing it offline mode, alternative to SQLite or alternative to core data. The cool thing about storing things locally, it uses the codable implementation. I've kind of already showed you guys this already as well, so I can quickly show it to you. It was in this extension, I believe. Yeah. So this is, I kind of already mentioned some of that because the chart supplement object is codable. You can store it to user defaults pretty easily, and you can code decode it. That's a common practice on how to store it into user defaults. So when the application is deleted, that goes away, that data goes away. Okay. Git Flow, kind of explain a little bit about this. Roughly, we're running short on time. It allows you to manage branches a lot easier, where in some cases you have a master branch and a develop branch. Develop is usually bleeding edge. Master is typically your production releases that are already in prod, and in some cases you do hot fixes. It's pretty nice because you can just do git space flow space feature or hotfix, and it knows how to manage all of those branches. In some cases, it's kind of a pain to manage multiple branches. You end up forgetting code changes in certain branches and stuff. So there's just a screenshot that's larger. Fastlane, I kind of mentioned this. It's an awesome feature to allow you to basically to do builds at the command line. You can do deploys into the app stores. This is not only for iOS, but it's also for Android. It's probably for some other different platforms as well. But I use it to a certain extent on the side. It works great for CI/CD integration. And I think that's about it. Any questions? Need help? Let me know. If you're wanting to integrate some kind of Snapchat API, help with iOS provisioning, try and hit me up on Discord, and I will try and do my best to try and give you any kind of assistance. Roblox. Hope this helped you guys. Hope that I didn't bore you guys a whole lot. I always enjoy doing these things for you guys. And thanks a lot. And most importantly, give iOS development a try. If you need help, just ask. I'll be here on Discord to a certain extent. And go hacking. Have fun, guys. Take care. Okay, Colton, can you hear me?
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Thank you for the lovely presentation.
It was a little long-winded in the beginning. I apologize, guys, but I was trying to explain some cool things about iOS development. So there's definitely plenty of jobs in the space. So.
All right, so we got some time now. We'll open up to Q&A. I know I myself have a couple questions to ask. So we'll watch the chat here, and I guess I'll start it off with one of my questions. So you had like your I think it was your Git Flow like image set up on one of the last few slides there. How like big of the gap would you say there is between what's like your bleeding edge development and what's actually pushed to your production?
Well, at Panera, we don't necessarily use Git Flow. I use it just for consistency on the side, on some of my side projects. That sometimes becomes a management headache. For the most part, like at Panera, we pretty much use develop for everything. We do share our code base between both applications for simplicity usage for building those targets and stuff. But so for the most part, we do like release branches, and in some cases, if we need a hot fix, we'll typically code those changes off of the release branch. So ultimately, we can make that quick hot fix, merge it into the release branch, and then merge it back down to develop. In true reality, in some cases, you might get a new dev. They may branch it off of develop, but a week and a half later, we might have some kind of issue where we might have to cherry pick. So that's one of those other kind of workarounds. Some cases cherry picks work great. Other
Yeah.
cases, you know, especially with some of these Xcode project files, like sometimes it's death by project files, especially with Cocoapods. With Swift Package Manager, that some of that headache or nightmare goes away. So.
Okay. I was
But
gonna, so I guess to follow up with that, so I've used Node Package Manager before, and
hmm
that can be a headache. Although it makes it easier, it can be a real
yeah,
headache sometimes when you get into versions and like.
yep.
Do you also run into similar problems with like CocoaPods and your managing your versions of different things?
Yeah, like we use a lot of Cocoapods. Some of the code we roll our own, but in other cases we can't avoid it. So yeah, it's similar to like Node Package Manager where it's generating metadata so Xcode can live and function within the realm of Xcode and the compilation states.
Yeah.
So ultimately, like yeah, like sometimes you can spend hours just trying to diff these XML files in Xcode, and it seemed like Apple knew that. It was a major pain point. That's why they're trying to move back to like Swift Package Manager. You can basically include a new package within Xcode, and I haven't really had too many issues with major deltas of XML files using it with Swift Package Manager. So, but yeah, it's kind of common. I even in the Java stack years ago, in some cases, I had some issues with doing like Maven stuff, but yeah, definitely still have version issues. Like even an open source library, in some cases, we'll fork an open source library if we have to make a hotfix change. So.
Yeah, I was gonna say, yeah, just the weeds of the different versions can really get to you sometimes.
Yeah, yeah, and even some libraries we've had to kind of ditch in the past where there's not much frequency of code commits, and we'll have to migrate from one library to the next. So we're trying to purge one right now. So,
Yeah. And then I
but
guess looking to the future, right? So, like I know I'm definitely going to be experimenting with this sort of development in the future. And I'm sure there are many people who are doing hacks on it or will be doing hacks on it in iOS. Do you have any like advice, any resources, anything we should be looking at for the future if we want to build off this great example you've given here?
Um, yeah, so this example is it was somewhat targeted for storyboards. The real latest technology really is Swift UI. I believe Andy, she's another developer on our team here. She does a phenomenal job on doing some Swift UI. She actually built the app clips implementation that we have at Panera. I believe some of that's actually Swift UI as well. So some of the go-to, I use Swift UI on the side. It's sometimes a great thing, but it's so brand new that some of the workarounds you have to do in some cases are a little painful. I would imagine within a year and a half, 2 years, it'd just be thousands of different examples out there on the net. So it's a completely different way of programming. It's programming by code, and there's like a visual preview editor that you can kind of do quick prototyping. So yeah, so it's transitioning in the Xcode. Apple, they're just constantly updating some of their libraries.
And then and as far as where do you have any sites or places where there's there's this sort of knowledge out? Are there good docs somewhere for looking into this sort of thing, or just good resources in general if I'm trying to learn more about and build more complex apps?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, there's some sites out there. I think Ray Wunderlich. I think that's one of the main sites. I've learned actually a lot. I've learned on Core Data. I use Core Data on the side. We actually use Core Data as well at Panera. But there's so many full functional projects where it's not like your typical Stack Exchange, one clip you're copy and pasting. It's full blown sample applications. That's probably the go-to one. That's really I if I do a Google search and I try and find something, typically I'll search for on Ray Wunderlich's site, or even I'll search for something and I'll put GitHub sample on my search query. So ultimately, I can pull down a full-blown GitHub project and literally run it. And so that's kind of the important thing that devs have to kind of get a little bit more familiar with. Not necessarily just pulling in a pod or pulling in a package. Pull down that source code and actually run it. You'll know that library so much deeper if you just pull down that source code and just run it through Xcode. That's helped a ton.
All right. Yeah, that's good to know, because I know I do a lot of Google searching as a dev, but I've never heard of Ray Wunderlich, so that was a new one for me.
It's a great site. I think some of them are paid for, where they actually they might get actually paid, but most of the content on there, it's like a full-blown application or a sample app that you can kind of walk through and run. And I think in some cases it'll actually show you like 2 stages of that sample, like if you want to code the whole thing, or if you want to just look at the full-blown example from the site. So
and I'll just I believe this is the right one, so I'll just pull that up right here for everyone to see. There's a website right here. But yeah, that does it for my questions. We can give the chat a minute or two more, see if anyone has any other questions. Just kind of wait for check that out.
Yeah, and if you guys, if anybody needs anything, I'll try and be online on and off as well. Andy from Panera, Kuoto, I believe that's how do you pronounce it? She's a great developer. Love her. She's helping everybody out right now here in the chat and stuff. So she's definitely a valuable asset for you guys as well. So I think we got about 4 Panera mentors here, so might be 5 or 6.
Yeah, I think I saw 4. Want to say 4.
Yeah. Any kind of questions, just let me know.
All right. Well, I am seeing no more questions, so I think we can wrap it up here. Thank you very much for preparing this for us. I'm sure we've all been excited to learn about this, about iOS and what you've been doing here. And thank you for providing a sample. That's something I haven't seen a lot of people do, is actually have like a GitHub repo ready to go walkthrough. Yeah, that's
I've learned that over the years. I've been doing hackathons for about on and off for about 4 or 5 years. Went to WashU and Mizzou several times, and that's some of the things where these guys have got to get up and going, and just a sample application might help, you know, uh, make things faster for development. So
yeah, that was great. Yeah, because that's just one extra resource, makes it a whole lot easier for hackers.
yeah, sounds great.
All right. Well, thank you for speaking. We will. Any other questions people have, you can. Are you Discord DMs open?
Yep.
All right.
Yeah, totally.
Yes.
Yeah, I'll leave it online, and sometimes if you need to ping me, I can kind of jump on one of those mentor help rooms. I'm new to Discord, but I'm figuring it out.
All righty. Well, we will we'll shut this down then. Yeah. Thanks again for speaking, Nick.
Okay.
And
Yeah,
I hope
no
to
problem.
see you around the hackathon as we progress throughout the next day or so.
Totally will.
All right.
All right. Well, thank you very much, guys. I appreciate it.
Have a good rest of your day.
All right. See you guys.
See you.